On the 16th of June this year, just as Julian Assange came one step closer to spending the rest of his life in an American supermax, another celebrated whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, died in California, aged 92. Like Assange, Ellsberg was put through hell by a US government, determined to hide its unsavory activities from the public. Ellsberg was born in Chicago in 1931, but raised in Detroit. A talented pianist, he stopped playing in 1948 after he lost his mother and sister in a car crash that occurred when his father fell asleep at the wheel. Gaining admission to Harvard on a scholarship, studying economics, he graduated summa cum laude. He followed that with 3 years in the US Marine Corps, where he commanded a platoon, before leaving in 1957 at the rank of first lieutenant. Back on Civvy Street, he began working as a strategic analyst for the Rand Corporation, a non-profit think tank on global affairs, where he specialized in nuclear policy. He produced research critical of the nuclear stance of the National Security Council and Strategic Air Command, while completing his PhD, again at Harvard. Formulating what is now known as the Ellsberg paradox, he contended that decisions made under conditions of uncertainty or ambiguity are often inconsistent with subjective probability. Moving to the Pentagon in August 1964 as a special assistant to Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, he then spent 2 years in South Vietnam, working for General Edward Lansdale as a member of the State Department. Returning from Asia to the Rand Corporation, Ellsberg, along with 33 other analysts, contributed to a 7,000-page classified study on the conduct of the Vietnam War. Known collectively as the Pentagon Papers, they were presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. In early 1969, Ellsberg's positions gradually began to shift. He became interested in the anti-war movement, attending seminars. At one such gathering in August 1969, at Haverford College, he experienced an epiphany while listening to a speech by a draft dodger, Randy Keller. On hearing Keller pronounce his excitement at joining other draft dodgers in prison, Ellsberg remarked many years later, "He said this very clearly. I hadn't known that he was about to be sentenced for draft resistance. It hit me as a total surprise and shock, because I heard his words in the midst of actually feeling proud of my country listening to him. And then I heard he was going to prison. It wasn't what he said exactly that changed my worldview. It was the example he was setting with his life, how his words in general showed that he was a stellar American, and that he was going to jail as a very deliberate choice, because he thought it was the right thing to do. There was no question in my mind that my government was involved in an unjust war that was going to continue and get larger. Thousands of young men were dying each year." Ellsberg further commented that had he not heard that speech, it wouldn't have occurred to him to do what he did next. In late 1969, with the assistance of another Rand Corporation employee, Anthony Russo, he secretly made several copies of the Pentagon Papers. The papers contained several embarrassing revelations. That the US government had concluded at the outset that the Vietnam War was unwinnable, and that the Johnson administration had lied to Congress and the public. Whilst this is hardly surprising, indeed expected in 2023, in an age less cynical about government, it was political dynamite. Ellsberg's first efforts at release were of a more establishment variety. They were offered to sympathetic anti-war senators J. William Fulbright and George McGovern. Were they to present the papers on the Senate floor, they would be immune from prosecution. He also circulated copies privately, as well as sharing a copy with the New York Times correspondent Neil Sheehan, on condition that he only took notes. Sheehan defied that stipulation, though, and copied the documents in full. The Rubicon was crossed on the 13th of June 1971, when actual excerpts were published in the New York Times. Previous articles had appeared in the papers, based around briefings. The Nixon administration obtained an injunction against any further publication for 15 days until the Supreme Court struck this down. An FBI manhunt had by now swung into action. During his attempt to evade it, Ellsberg had also passed the papers to Ben Bagdikian of the Washington Post, before on the 28th of June, publicly admitting that he was the source of the documents and turning himself in at the Boston office of the U.S. Attorney. Whilst the embarrassing fallout of the papers landed primarily on members of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the Nixon administration was furious at the effect of the release on public trust in government in general. Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, immediately demanded that the New York Times cease publication and was able to obtain another injunction, which would eventually be overturned. In an attempt to squash further leaks, White House staff formed the, quote, White House Plumbers, a covert team of burglars, which would later precipitate the Watergate scandal. In August 1971, they were handed the assignment of discrediting Ellsberg by gathering information on him, starting with the burglary of files from Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Louis Fielding, which took place on the 3rd of September 1971. The operation was a flop. No embarrassing information was found. Then the government moved on to the big stuff. Ellsberg and Russo were charged under the 1917 Espionage Act, as well as charges of theft and conspiracy. They faced 115 and 35-year maximum sentences, respectively. The trial began on the 3rd of January 1973, presided over by District Judge William Matthew Byrne, Jr. Ellsberg's initial defence that he was not aiding the enemy was thrown out by Byrne. But from this unpromising start, events began to turn. Byrne found out about the psychiatric office break-in and ordered that the defence must be informed. Soon after, it was revealed that Ellsberg had been wiretapped without a court order by the FBI. As if all this wasn't shady enough, Byrne also revealed that White House counsel John Ehrlichman had requested a meeting with him, during which he offered Byrne the post of director of the FBI, which Byrne naturally pointed out would be a conflict of interest during the trial. On the 11th of May 1973, the judge finally lost patience and dismissed all charges against Ellsberg and Russo, after the prosecution claimed they'd lost the wiretap records and could not produce them. He said, "The totality of the circumstances of this case, which I have only briefly sketched, offend a sense of justice. The bizarre events have incurably infected the prosecution of this case." Totally vindicated, Ellsberg became a prominent author, speaker, and activist, protesting the seemingly never-ending wars of U.S. foreign policy. He spoke in support of the recent whistleblowers such as Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and Julia Assange. Speaking of his experiences, he said, "The public is lied to every day by the president, by his spokespeople, by his officers. If you can't handle the thought that the president lies to the public for all kinds of reasons, you couldn't stay in government at that level. The fact is, presidents rarely say the whole truth, essentially never say the whole truth of what they expect and what they're doing and what they believe and why they're doing it, and rarely refrain from lying, actually, about these matters." He made the news again on the 22nd of May 2021, sharing more classified documents with the New York Times concerning a proposed U.S. nuclear strike on China in 1958 over tensions surrounding Taiwan. Diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March 2023, Ellsberg died 3 months later. It is to be hoped that the trail he blazed and the legacy he left will be enough to save the many courageous whistleblowers who are today fighting for their lives and freedom for the simple act of telling the truth about government crimes.